this challenge of politics is going toward a 6th edition as a textbook. And he also happens to be a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he earned the Bronze Star. And he spent a good deal of time in the world of intelligence. So I give you Mr. Doug Simon, who's here on a rainy evening. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight we're going to talk about intelligence. Not the stuff up here necessarily. It's the world of espionage and spies. And the story, really, of the birth and growth of the modern American intelligence community to truly mammoth proportions. Most Americans just don't know how big this complex of organizations is. It's a pretty extraordinary story. And while we understand, particularly in an age of terrorism, the necessity for accurate intelligence, knowing what our adversaries are doing, knowing the potential threats and so forth, the necessity of accurate intelligence. How does the existence of an ever-expanding bureaucracy that is based on security and secrecy square with our democratic values? How do we balance our need for security with the protection for privacy, freedom of movement, open communications? Now, a large centralized intelligence agency was not part of the early government of the United States. In fact, that does not really come to pass until the advent of 3 monumental events: World War II, the Cold War, and 9/11. That does not mean that earlier in history there was no interest in intelligence. General George Washington was an avid user of intelligence, as well as a consummate practitioner of the craft. He recruited and ran a number of agents. He set up several spy rings, devised secret methods of reporting, all to gain information on and to deceive the British armies. Now, during the Revolution, one of the spies recruited and trained by Washington was Sergeant Daniel Bissell, who was lodged in the British ranks. So secret was his existence and mission that Washington himself was the only one that knew that he was, in fact, a member of the Revolutionary Forces, not the British. Well, partway through the war, Daniel Bissell was captured by the Revolutionary Army, and they were about to hang him as a member of the British Army. Washington intervened and basically said, wait a minute, I wouldn't do that. Bissell has been one of my personal spies since the beginning of the war. He then was awarded one of only 3 Purple Hearts given during the conflict. Washington had created the award not for being wounded, as it is today, but for particularly meritorious service. Now, I know about this only because my wife is an avid genealogist, and it turns out Bissell is my wife's family name, and she can trace a direct lineage to Sergeant Daniel Bissell. Now, after Washington served as our first president, interest in intelligence as a tool of executive power appears to have waned, but regained prominence during the Civil War. Both the Union and Confederate leadership valued intelligence, established their own spy networks, and often railed at the press for providing intelligence to the other side. In 1863, the first professional intelligence organization was established by the Union forces, and it was known as the Bureau of Military Intelligence, headed by the commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Joseph Hooker. The Bureau was abolished at the end of the war, but as a byproduct of that action, there was the creation of the Secret Service, established in 1865, not to protect the president and other officials as it does today, but to combat counterfeiting. The next big step was in 1882 when the first permanent intelligence organization, the Office of Naval Intelligence, was created. The administration of Theodore Roosevelt saw perhaps the most active use of intelligence for foreign policy purposes by any president until that time. Among other things, Roosevelt used intelligence operatives to incite a revolution in Panama to justify annexing the Panama Canal. And in 1907, he relied on intelligence that showed the military buildup of the Japanese as a justification to launch the worldwide cruise of what was known as the Great White Fleet as a display of U.S. naval force. When the United States entered World War I, it lacked a coordinated intelligence effort. As a champion of open diplomacy, President Woodrow Wilson had disdained the use of spies and was generally suspicious of intelligence. His views on the subject appeared to change, however, as a result of his close association developed with the British intelligence chief stationed in Washington, D.C. In June of 1917, the first U.S. Signals Intelligence Agency was formed with the Army. Known as MI-8, the agency was charged with decoding military communications and providing codes for use by U.S. forces. In 1919, at the end of the war, the agency was transferred to the State Department, and it was then called the Black Chamber. It focused on diplomatic rather than military communications. Its most successful operation was in 1920-21, when the Black Chamber broke the Japanese codes and provided valuable information to U.S. negotiators at the Washington Conference on Naval Disarmament. Now, despite such successes, President Hoover decided that the State Department's interception of diplomatic cables and correspondence could not be tolerated. His Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, made his famous statement on the issue that, quote, "Gentlemen do not read each other's mail." Boy, have things changed. The role of the Black Chamber was returned to strictly military intelligence under the Army Signal Corps. And this brings us to World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 was a major intelligence disaster. As subsequent investigations found, intelligence had been handled in a rather casual, uncoordinated manner, and there had been insufficient attention to certain collection requirements. America's entrance into the war created an immediate need for intelligence to support U.S. forces. And while the Army and Navy maintained their own intelligence capabilities, none were prepared to provide the kind of support that was needed. And to bolster the effort, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was created in June of 1942 under William Wild Bill Donovan. Now, Donovan was rather a colorful fellow, was the recipient of the Medal of Honor in World War I, a U.S. attorney from Western New York after the war who was particularly energetic in the enforcement of prohibition. He is the only person in U.S. history to have received all four of the United States' highest awards: the Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, the National Security Medal, and the Medal of Honor. Now, there was no precedence for building an organization like the OSS, and this in turn led Donovan to recruit some of the quirkiest, innovative, and yes, bravest of patriots. The OSS philosophy was that bright people could get things done, regardless of class, gender, ethnicity, or formal schooling. That was pretty revolutionary for the 1940s. Intelligence people from a wide variety of backgrounds was the name of the game. When Julia Child, long before she became a world-famous cooking guru, joined the OSS, for example, she was a recent Smith College graduate who was put to work typing, typical, and doing clerical tasks. But later, she was inserted into the OSS Research and Development Group to invent a new shark repellent. Former Brooklyn Dodgers and Chicago White Sox catcher Mo Berg happened to be a law school graduate and an amateur linguist who was widely read in science. Recruited into the OSS, he had missions in Italy and Switzerland to interview scientists on atom bomb development and jet technology being pursued by the Germans. Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was a black St. Louis native who became a singing star at the Folies Bergère in Paris during the 1920s and 30s. She affiliated herself with the French underground after the Nazi-occupied Paris and performed many small covert duties for the OSS as well as British intelligence. Now, the American military establishment was really skeptical of the value of OSS activities, and the new unit faced really strong competition from Army intelligence organizations. No doubt there was a bit of turf protection here. The difficulties that the OSS had in its relationship to military intelligence reaffirmed Donovan's belief that the peacetime successor to the OSS should be a civilian organization directly responsible to the President of the United States. And in 1944, Donovan started campaigning for that model. On July 27, 1947, President Truman signed into law the National Security Act, creating a post-war national security framework that included both the National Security Council, consisting of the President and his foreign policy and national security advisors, and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, with the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, as its head. At the time, it was the only agency charged with a national intelligence mission. Now, one interesting aspect of the founding of the Central Intelligence Agency was that the authorities and functions of the CIA were left intentionally vague. For instance, there was no mention of espionage or spying, nor was there any wording to suggest that covert actions such as secret operations to influence political conditions in other countries were part of the new agency's charter. Rather, the CIA was authorized to perform, and now I'm quoting, services of common concern to other intelligence agencies as may be determined by National Security Council, and to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the NSC may from time to time direct. End of quote. Well, you are not going to get much vaguer than that. Where the statute did get very specific, however, was in expressing a prohibition on the CIA's having any police, subpoena, law enforcement powers, or internal security functions. In other words, stay out of domestic intelligence and law enforcement. That's the job of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, the first top secret orders from the National Security Council to the Central Intelligence Agency were issued in December of 1947 and directed the agency to conduct covert psychological operations designed to counter Soviet and Soviet-inspired activities. And the very first task? To beat the communists in the Italian elections set for April 1948. Think about that. The U.S. interfering in another country's elections. Think about that in light of our last presidential election. Now, while World War II was the first major stimulus for establishing a national intelligence effort, the Cold War was the second great turning point in the development of the intelligence community. As one might surmise, the operation was pretty modest in the beginning, with the number of employees in the initial year or two numbering perhaps in the hundreds. But that soon changed, and both the number of people working not only in the Central Intelligence Agency, but in the intelligence community in general began to increase at a rapid pace, as did the number of organizational units devoted to various aspects of intelligence. Suffice to say that in 1947, the intelligence community pretty much was the early CIA, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and Army Intelligence. Period. That was it. The Air Force was just born with the National Security Act, so they were barely off the ground in terms of their own intelligence arm. And then, of course, there was the FBI, which was largely concerned with domestic problems like organized crime. But soon, Cold War espionage within the United States quickly became a second big focus of the Bureau. Now, as the handout that I think most of you have indicates with the chart, today the intelligence community of the United States consists of 16 departments or agencies, in addition to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, a position that was created in the wake of 9/11. In addition to the CIA and the NSA, there are some units you may not have even heard of. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency? What the heck do they do? Well, they do sophisticated mapping. And the National Reconnaissance Office is in charge of all satellite-generated intelligence. In addition, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, the Department of Energy, Treasury, Homeland Security, all have distinct intelligence operations. And of course, the military has its intelligence organizations, the biggest one being the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is enormous, as well as Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard intelligence. And then there is the National Counterterrorism Center, staffed by more than 500 personnel drawn from all the 16 departments and agencies and offices that make up the intelligence community. Now, while I will talk a little bit about the CIA in a few moments, I think it's appropriate to make some initial comments about the NSA, or the National Security Agency. You know, for most Americans during the Cold War years, the intelligence community began and ended with the CIA. Hardly anyone knew the NSA even existed. But the revelations of Edward Snowden about the activities of NSA, first published in 2013, certainly changed that. If you remember, Mr. Snowden worked for a private contractor that was commissioned by the National Security Agency. And after repeatedly bringing his concerns to his superiors with no response, Snowden took it upon himself to release a boatload of classified documents that revealed the extent of NSA's activity. Now, many experts, both inside and outside the intelligence field, have believed for years that the NSA, not the CIA, was the most powerful intelligence agency, not merely in the United States, but in the world. Ever since its inception in 1952, and up until very recently, it has been cloaked in secrecy. Very happy to take a back seat to its sister agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. But we know a little more about the NSA in recent years, thanks to Snowden, and also the best-selling books by James Bamford, The Puzzle Palace, Body of Secrets, and most recently, The Shadow Factory. They're listed on the bibliography on the back of that handout. The mission of the National Security Agency in general terms is communications intelligence, or something known as SIGINT. Under that broad term, the agency engages in communications intelligence. Put another way, it mostly listens in on other people's conversations, whether over telephone lines, cell phones, fiber optics, email, or any other means by which people or government agencies talk to each other. It also targets electronic intelligence, known as ELINT, picking up the electronic signals of various weapon systems, radar, guidance systems on missiles, and so forth. And finally, a big part of NSA's operations involves cryptology and the breaking of codes. The headquarters for the NSA is Fort Meade in Maryland, between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and consists of a campus of over 50 buildings. The main building runs roughly 1.4 million square feet, just about the size of the Pentagon in Washington. Some of the data uncovered by Bamford is pretty stunning. When it was first constructed, the central NSA building at Fort Meade housed 7,560,000 linear feet of telephone wire. and 70,000 square feet of permanently sealed windows. It has the nation's largest unobstructed corridor of 980 feet. The number of people working at Fort Meade is classified, but it is thought to be in the range of 25 to 30,000. With the largest concentration of linguists in the world, NSA operates in 95 languages, including all dialects of Arabic, and provides training in all of the languages as well. The NSA gathers communications intelligence from a variety of platforms, including ground stations with large antennae, specially equipped airplanes, surface vessels and submarines, and of course satellites. In all, outside of Fort Meade, in the field, there are roughly 6,000 operators manning over 2,000 intercept positions, 24 hours a day, around the world. At the heart of NSA's operation are giant supercomputers, many built by the Cray Corporation. In 2010, the Cray X3 was the central machine. The X3 is capable of carrying a sustained speed of more than a quadrillion calculations per second. That exceeds what is known as the petaflop barrier. The problem was that the agency made it known within the Pentagon that by 2018 it needed a computer capable of what is known as the exaflop barrier, or exflop speed, 1 quintillion operations a second. That is a 1 followed by 18 zeros. To that end, NSA is building a brand new $900 million supercomputer center that is to be completed this year that presumably will have the exflop capability. Since 9/11, NSA has expanded with new giant facilities in Georgia, Hawaii, Texas, and Utah. All told, just these 5 primary NSA operational centers alone will have over 2.5 million square feet of operating space. Now, there are 3 big problems facing NSA today. The first is information overload. The gathering of information is just too massive, and there is considerable difficulty in processing it through the most sophisticated computer filtering systems ever devised by man. Once the computerized filtering process is over, then the resulting bits of information must be analyzed by humans. The problem is there is just too much information to process. The second and chronic problem is keeping up with real-world technology. For instance, one of the biggest problems NSA faced was the shift from microwave and satellite communications to fiber optic cables. The roads or avenues of communications are constantly shifting, and with each shift there are technical problems. The third problem revolves around both ethical and legal issues. The assault on privacy, most specifically the privacy of American citizens, and it is a very big concern. And I will comment on that in a moment, because the problem goes far beyond the NSA. It involves the entire span of intelligence efforts in the war on terrorism. Well, enough on NSA for now. Just to refresh our memories, the intelligence community involves 16 major departments or agencies, in addition to the DNI's office, the Director of National Intelligence. In all, it employs somewhere between 850,000 and 900,000 people, almost 1 million people. The combined budgets of just the 3 central agencies, the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, run in excess of $40 billion a year. But even that is just a guess, because so many hidden and classified appropriations. And that brings us to the question of how big this empire built on secrecy needs to be. No one is disputing the need for intelligence as a necessary part of our national security. But how much is enough? Do the resources match the threat? How much secrecy can a democracy tolerate? At what point does such a bureaucratic empire become unmanageable? Critical questions we'll try to address. Over the years, there certainly has been some intelligence successes for the United States. Perhaps the biggest overall success was the CIA's aerial reconnaissance programs in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, before satellite reconnaissance began to take over. These aerial programs, utilizing the U-2 and SR-71 high-altitude aircraft, were as much as anything responsible for America's reasonably accurate monitoring of the development of the Soviet nuclear arsenal and intercontinental ballistic missile program. In line with that was the turning of Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, an officer in the Soviet military intelligence, who during the 50s and 60s provided a treasure trove of information on the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Now, when Penkovsky first volunteered his services, the CIA was very skeptical. So British MI6, British intelligence, immediately stepped in and began handling it. And then later, after they wised up, the CIA joined the effort once again to handle it. There were questions about whether or not he was a Soviet plant, but I think that has been pretty much debunked. I had some tangential personal experience with this. While working in Air Force intelligence in Vietnam, I worked closely with three intelligence officers who had come from what was then the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, the command that was in charge of all our land-based and air-based nuclear weapon systems. They had been involved in processing a lot of the technical information that Penkovsky was supplying, and they told me that without question, his information was genuine and incredibly valuable. I think one could make the case that Oleg Penkovsky was the most valuable human intelligence resource in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. There were other more specific missions that were successful, such as the rescue of Americans from Iran, as depicted in the book and the recent movie Argo. I assume some of you have seen that. Although, in that case, I think the Canadians deserve a lot of the credit as well. But alas, even some of the successes came back to haunt the agency and American foreign policy as well. In 1954, in Guatemala, the CIA helped engineer a coup d'etat ousting the duly elected president, Guzman. And nearly 20 years later, in 1973, the agency was successful in helping to engineer the ouster of President Salvador Allende in Chile. Now, both of these operations accomplished their immediate mission, but according to many foreign service personnel, did nothing to advance U.S.-Latin American relations. During the 1980s, the CIA successfully aided the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. But years later, that appeared to backfire when the very people that we aided turned their weapons on us. And then there are the out-and-out miserable failures, such as the Cuban Bay of Pigs in 1961, which was a CIA operation, as well as the failures to anticipate both the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the same year. And let us not forget CIA head George Tenet calling the certainty of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, in Iraq a slam dunk. Although in this case it's hard to tell if greater culpability should fall on the intelligence community or on the policymakers who were absolutely convinced of the existence of WMDs in Iraq, despite the lack of solid, real-time, reliable intelligence. And of course, we invaded and found no WMDs. But for me, the greatest failure was the community's inability to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. Decades of intelligence operations focused on the USSR, hundreds of assets, and the use of the most sophisticated technological listening devices known to man, and yet a total failure to see the collapse coming. But as bad as these failures were, they really did not transform the intelligence community in any major way. Yes, there was a lot of hand-wringing and some tinkering and reforms, but nothing really fundamental. And this leads us to the third turning point for the American intelligence community, the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. By the way, also viewed as a colossal failure for American intelligence. Two things happened as a result of this tragedy. First, the focus of the intelligence community dramatically and almost instantaneously shifted to combating terrorism. And second, because of the enormous assets now devoted to the task of defending against the terrorist threat, the intelligence community once again exploded in size. In July of 2010, Dana Priest and William M. Arkin published a remarkable piece in the Washington Post on the impact of 9/11 on the secret world of intelligence. It was based on a 2-year investigation of the post-9/11 intelligence community. And they also published a book, Top Secret America, based on their research. At the outset of the article, they wrote the following: "The top secret world the government created in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 has become so large, so unwieldy, and so secretive that no one knows how much money it costs, how many people it employs, how many programs exist within it, or exactly how many agencies do the same work. After 9 years of unprecedented spending and growth, the result is that the system put in place to keep the United States safe is so massive that its effectiveness is impossible to determine." Among their findings, the following: some 1,271 government organizations, 1,931 private companies work on programs related to counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence. An estimated 900,000 people hold top secret security clearances in this country. In Washington and the surrounding area, in 2010, 7 years ago, 33 building complexes for top secret intelligence work were under construction or had been built since 9/11. Together, they occupy the equivalent of almost 3 Pentagons, or 22 U.S. Capitol buildings, about 17 million square feet of space. This, of course, does not include the vast NSA facilities we spoke of earlier, built in Hawaii, Georgia, Texas, and Utah. Nor does it include the 2,000 listening stations around the world and the CIA personnel stationed in virtually every country in the world, both inside and outside U.S. embassies. No less than 51 federal organizations and military commands operating in 15 U.S. cities track the flow of money to and from terrorist networks. Analysts who make sense of documents and conversations obtained by foreign and domestic spying share their judgment by publishing 50,000 intelligence reports each year. While anti-terrorism was the new mission after 9/11, do not forget the other missions that remain and could not be forgotten and ignored. The intelligence community still has to keep track of the development and deployment of strategic and tactical nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological. Gather and analyze intelligence on political corruption in other countries. Gather intelligence on potential coups, revolutions, and general instability in various regions of the world. Assess the likelihood of interstate war being generated between countries. Keep track of enemy as well as friendly orders of battle. In other words, various military force levels, configurations, levels of technology in other countries. And gather and analyze tons of intelligence on economic transactions, drug trafficking, and energy sources. We know that 9/11 caused this explosion in the growth of the intelligence community. But how was it manifest? Was it merely an expansion of the existing agencies? No, the answer was obviously the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which, by the way, is as much a law enforcement agency as it is an intelligence agency. Not only were intelligence units formed within the department, there was the establishment of new units at the state and municipal levels all over the country. Perhaps the most dramatic example of the latter is the New York City Anti-Terrorist Center that some say matches almost anything in Washington. Now that may be a stretch, but it is no secret that millions and millions of dollars have been dedicated to its creation and its operation. And as for oversight of this enormously complex system, some 90, think about this, 90 congressional committees and subcommittees have held some degree of oversight authority over the Department of Homeland Security since it was established. That translates to all 100 senators and at least 412 of the 435 members of the House of Representatives. Simply put, the current system of congressional oversight is dangerously dysfunctional and jeopardizes the DHS's ability to respond to the threat of terrorism. Now, there are a number of dangers to having such a large and powerful intelligence community. I cannot address them all, but a couple of examples. The first is what we might call accountability. Do we always know what these organizations are doing? This problem was never more apparent than in 1975 during what became known as the Church hearings, named after the chairman, Senator Frank Church of the state of Idaho. The hearings looked into the charges that the CIA was running rogue special operations without authority, or at least very little. The first thing that came up were the revelations that the U.S. Army had been spying on U.S. citizens during the late 1960s, namely spying on anti-war protesters protesting the Vietnam War. Clearly a violation of U.S. law. And soon the hearings revealed that government intelligence agencies were engaging in a variety of activities that exceeded their mandate and were either of questionable legality or outright illegal. Now, the dam broke on the 22nd of December 1974 when the New York Times published a lengthy article by Seymour Hersh, an investigative reporter, detailing CIA covert action programs involving assassination attempts against foreign leaders, and covert attempts to subvert foreign governments were reported for the first time. Among the matters investigated were covert operations with the intent to assassinate. This is American intelligence people assassinating foreign leaders, including Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, the Diem brothers of Vietnam, General Rene Schneider of Chile, and President John F. Kennedy's plan to use the mafia to overthrow and kill Fidel Castro in Cuba, something known as Operation Mongoose. Under recommendation and pressure by the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford issued an executive order to ban United States-sanctioned assassinations of foreign leaders. It's now against the law. Members of the intelligence community and the conservative press, and some of the more conservative members of the House and Senate, were highly critical of the hearings and their results. It was their belief that the hearings had literally gutted what they believed to be the absolutely necessary covert arm of the Central Intelligence Agency, and never forgave Senator Church for it. On the other hand, there is little question that elements within the CIA had gone rogue, were embarking on highly controversial operations, the legality and morality of which were questionable. The second big issue surrounding our enormous intelligence empire is the threat to privacy. The crux of the problem lies in the activities of the National Security Agency in the war against terror. True, there have been other privacy scandals, such as when the CIA spied on American protesters during the Vietnam War era, but in reality, the spying on U.S. citizens during the Bush administration was far more serious, given the remarkable capabilities of the NSA, combined with a desire to get the terrorist at any cost. And regardless of what you think about Mr. Snowden, who revealed the extent of NSA surveillance programs, the NSA scandal raised serious questions about wiretapping and surveillance. Wiretapping of American citizens by the National Security Agency, NSA, requires a warrant from a 3-judge court set up under the Foreign Intelligence Service Act of 1978. Foreign Intelligence Service Surveillance Act obviously led to the acronym FISA, or the FISA Court. After 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed in late October of 2001 and granted extraordinary powers to the president in going after terrorists that might harm the country. The Bush administration bypassed the FISA Court and set up what was known as the Terrorist Surveillance Program, under which NSA was authorized to monitor, without search warrants, phone calls, internet activity, emails, text messaging, and other communications within the United States. Under considerable public pressure, the Bush administration abandoned the warrantless wiretap program in 2007 and returned to review of surveillance by the FISA court. In 2008, Congress amended the original FISA Act, relaxing some of the original court requirements. Under the Obama administration, the NSA continued operating under the new FISA guidelines, but in 2009 acknowledged that the agency had, quote, over-collected its domestic communications in excess of the FISA court's authority. So what you have is a situation of various administrations 1 minute complying with the warrants issued by the FISA court, and the next minute abandoning it and bypassing it, and then reversing and going back again. The most dangerous practice by the intelligence community is called mass surveillance, the pervasive surveillance of an entire population, or at least a substantial part of such a population. We most often think of these programs as confined to totalitarian states or dictatorships of one sort or another, the world of George Orwell's 1984, if you will. But in reality, mass surveillance has and is being used in democratic systems as well. In the United States, mass surveillance has been used during wartime for censorship to monitor communications. Something known as the COINTELPRO project, or counterintelligence program, was run from 1956 to 1971, targeting what were thought to be subversive organizations, including anti-war and racial equality activists. Things really got serious after 9/11, and vast networks of mass surveillance were instituted, not only using the FBI, NSA, and Homeland Security, but state and local police as well as military and criminal investigators. The system is pretty vast and exploits three primary tools: the tapping of telephones, the use of surveillance cameras, which are now hundreds of thousands throughout the major cities of America, something called data mining, essentially the gathering of information on citizens' financial records, internet surfing habits, and monitoring of email. Now, I bring all of this up not to present some thorough and complete accounting of every mass surveillance program in the country, but I think as the technology becomes more and more pervasive and efficient, the issue of privacy in a democracy becomes critical. Certainly the argument can be made that these kinds of programs can be of enormous assistance to law enforcement as well as counterterrorism, making all of us safer. But because they are gaining in efficiency and pervasiveness, serious questions about the privacy of American citizens arise. Now, I know this is a lot to digest, but I hope at a minimum that I've been able to impress upon you just how large the intelligence community has grown over the last 60 years, and the enormity of its scope of operations. Now, it is not as if there is some smoking gun that proves that this enormous surveillance capability has been used for personal profit, political gain, or some other nefarious purpose. But it is because of this enormous intrusive capability we are faced with the potential for misuse. This evening, I leave you with three bottom-line questions. First, are certain rights as Americans in a democracy threatened by virtue of this vast intelligence empire that is based largely on secrecy? Second, is the intelligence community too large, too invasive, and too powerful? And third, what is the proper balance between ensuring the security of our citizens and their personal freedoms? On that, I will close and be happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
What do you propose as solutions to how pervasive the system is becoming?
The most dreaded question to a public speaker is the first question in which there is no answer, or at least easy answer. Okay? The first thing is recognizing the problem. And I don't think, even with Snowden's revelations, sending out of these documents, I think the American public is so obsessed with security because of the terrorism business, and understandably so, I understand that they don't appreciate, nor do I think they care that much about this phenomenon, what has happened here. So I think the first thing is education. The kind of thing I'm doing right here. Do you realize how big this problem is? Almost 1 million people with top secret clearances. All this data mining and interception of communications and so forth. All to keep us safe. I understand that. But do you realize domestically, and I do not, when I say this, I do not mean to trivialize the suffering of people who have been the victims of terrorism, bombings and shootings and so forth. I would never do that. But the odds for the average American of being killed or injured by a terrorist act in this country is in excess of 1 in 2 million. It jumps worldwide to something on the order of 1 in 6 million. You got better odds of winning local lotteries than you do getting hit by a terrorist. That is not an excuse for doing nothing. I had a big argument with my oldest son the other night about airline security. You know, and pain in the neck going through security and getting checked and bags open and all that. And I said, hallelujah, I'm in a metal tube up there at 36,000 feet. I don't want to get blown out of the sky. I don't care about the inconvenience there. But it does bother me when so much of our communication system, our electronic, our digital communication system, is being eavesdropped on. And some of it is collateral. In other words, they're trying to zero in on specific people, terrorists, known terrorists, or suspected terrorists, and so forth. But by virtue of that kind of scooping up all that communication, they're getting everything. One of the things Snowden came up with, which was fascinating, was how the intelligence community went in and strong-armed the high-tech communication systems, Facebook, Google, to piggyback on their communication system so they could monitor the traffic going through Google and Facebook and so forth. Nobody knew about this. Nobody knew this was going on. So I think the information, getting it out, is the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to say Congress oversight. Congress is doing nothing right now. It's this horrible gridlock that's been going on for 2 or 3 years now, and is still continuing to do that. But hopefully at some point, wiser heads will prevail and at least examine this system and say, you know, this system is very intrusive and it's very good. Maybe we got to get a better handle on it. Yes?
Well, I believe that congressional percentage needed that their inadequacies are no one else to blame. How would you say that we can proceed as a country, given that the president is unwilling at times to acknowledge how much the intelligence community does know? Well, you do obviously point out how perhaps inadequate they can be given their size. They do know a lot. When he says that he knows more than generals or doesn't give an acknowledgement what the intelligence community tells us, how can we move forward given his inability to understand or lack of willingness to acknowledge how much they do know?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't think that there's too much you can do when it involves direct presidential decision making. Okay? He's going to do what he's going to do. I think the answer for now is what has been termed the guardians of the gate, the supposedly intelligent generals surrounding him, National Security Advisor, Mattis, the Secretary of State, Kelly, the Chief of Staff, and so forth, the supposed grown-ups in the White House. Saying to Mr. President at some point, you can't do that. You can't move that fast. You can't just all of a sudden start dropping atomic bombs on North Korea. You can't do it. That's putting a lot of faith in guys that weren't elected. But it's a big, I think it's a big problem. I also think it's a tricky business because in some cases you have to separate one of his personality characteristics, which is bluster, and the reality. For instance, I'll give you one real quick example. He railed against increasing the sanctions against the Russian Republic for the invasion of Crimea and the Ukraine Peninsula. Yet when push came to shove, he went ahead, mumbling and grumbling, and signed the legislation, increasing it. So at some point you have to try to separate, if possible, or as much as you can, his verbosity, his blowhardedness, the tweeting, the statements that come out, and the reality of what he does. Now, bottom line, you may disagree with what he does in terms of policy, but I think in at least some cases you're going to find a difference between what he's done and what he in fact said. A lot of what he says is for effect purposes, perhaps ego, other things. I think in the world of international relations it's dangerous, to be honest with you, because words matter. Other governments listen to what presidents say. And I think you have a situation in terms of security in Europe along the Russian border between Eastern European countries, in terms of North Korea, just to cite two examples where other governments are not sure what U.S. policy in fact is. And I think that's a dangerous situation. Sorry for a long involved answer. Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on whistleblowers such as Julian Assange?
I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts on whistleblowers such as Julian Assange?
Yeah.
Do you think they play an important role in preserving democracy, or is your undermining?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it certainly applies to Snowden and the release of the documents, the NSA documents. We were talking about this briefly over dinner. I think I'm going to concentrate on Snowden because I know more about him than I do some of the other whistleblowers. I think Snowden has to be held accountable for what he did. What he did was illegal. And when he comes back to the United States, assuming he does it, I think he will stand trial. And I think he'll be found guilty. The interesting part of that whole process will be the sentencing part. I don't know what a jury or federal judges will do, because the information that he released was absolutely mind-boggling in terms of the extent of NSA's intrusion, and potentially dangerous. The problem I have, and this goes back to my days when I was in intelligence, the problem I have is private citizens taking it upon themselves to release classified information. That's dangerous. Lives can be lost because of that. Not because that whistleblower specifically identifies somebody working, an American spy working in Russia, but he reveals certain kinds of information, let's say, classified information, that can only come from one source. And once the Russians or the Chinese or whoever it is, once they recognize that source, that information, and what the source must be, they will go directly to it, and they will identify who that person is or persons are. And they can lose their lives. There have been other whistleblowers earlier in the intelligence game, in the CIA, that in fact released information that cost the lives of over a dozen American spies in Russia during the Cold War. So the whole business of taking it upon themselves to release this information is, I think, a really dangerous, tricky business. Look at the world of intelligence, as is the case for the world of politics, is full of hypocrisy and contradictions. It's not black and white. It's not always right and wrong. It's mixed. There's lots of gray areas, and Snowden's a good example of that. He violated the law. He took it upon himself to release that information in violation of his contract. He should be held accountable, but the information he released was incredibly valuable. to the American public. Yeah.
So while we violate the law, do you believe there's a better way? How should American citizens gain knowledge and understanding of the BAP programs if it's not the private citizens releasing?
Well, he went to his immediate superiors repeatedly and said, do you guys realize the extent to which this is going on? This is illegal. These guys are going, they're bypassing the FISA courts, they're listening to people illegally and so forth. This is intolerable. And his bosses didn't do anything about it. So, from his standpoint, he said, I tried to stay within the system and to do what was right because I recognize this is a really dangerous practice and American people don't realize how far this has gone. On the other hand, he violated his contract, violated the United States law, okay? And in doing that, let's put it this way, it's potentially a very dangerous practice, a very dangerous practice. I don't know what the answer is. That's why we've got judges who are wise men. They'll decide on the sentencing. It'll be interesting to see what comes up. Yes?
For the people in the room that are possibly looking at the future, with
Yeah.
all of your wisdom, with all of the troubles you've had, of course, in your past, what would be your main advice to the people that are looking to possibly reform the system in the future? Kind of, if you were in our shoes right now and you had the ability to go into the government and say, hey, this is what we should do, what would be your first step and advice to us?
If you are interested, let me put it this way, there's a certain, I don't want to say it's a mythology, but I think it is, there's an overestimate of the effectiveness of people, well, I'm going to change things from the inside. It's not that easy, folks. It's not that it can't be changed from inside. It's very difficult. And it's very difficult in organizations like this, which are built upon secrecy. Okay? There are thousands and thousands of people working in these systems. So one person coming in to change that is very difficult. If it were something like this that you sought to change, if what I've said tonight really bothered you, you know, and you say, we shouldn't put up with this stuff, we should do something about it. I would, personally, one avenue would be to go to work for organizations, perhaps non-governmental organizations, that look into this sort of thing. The one that comes to mind is the American Civil Liberties Union, which has gotten involved in the Snowden case, as many other whistleblower type cases. That would be one way to do it. The other thing, I think, is to really, in an honest, open way, educate yourself. By where you go to school, what you study, keeping an open mind, trying to be as objective as possible, and really learn in depth what is going on. Don't just accept something because somebody tells you to, a person in authority. Don't be afraid to challenge it. Don't be afraid to read alternative sources of material. And to remain skeptical. Skeptics, right?